Hey, gang, your pal Tim here, doing something a little different this week. We've got a wonderful episode with our guest, Erin Grayson Sapp, and I can't think of a better way to set up the topic than this fairly long clip from a wonderful and fantastic documentary that ran about 10 years ago on Showtime called Full Color Football, all about the American Football League. And give a listen, and you'll understand why this is a great way to set up this conversation that we'll have after we hear this clip from Full Color Football. Here's the voice of Peter Coyote setting up this week's topic. Give a listen, and we'll see you on the other side.
In July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed, outlawing discrimination in public places.
We must not approach this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long.
The letter of the law changed instantly, but the spirit of the country would take time.
In the South and Southwest, desegregation was far from what the law required it to be.
Six months after the Civil Rights Act was signed, the AFL All-Star Game was scheduled for New Orleans, a city without a professional sports team.
We were trying very hard to acquire either an NFL or AFL expansion franchise for the city.
That's why the game was put down there to see what type of drawing power the AFL would have with an all-star game.
Black players soon discovered that New Orleans' red carpet was for whites only.
In the restaurants, the patrons didn't want us to sit anywhere near them, or the coats, we'd hang our coats on the wall and say, hey, don't put your coat next to mine.
I checked in, and I hear in the background somebody ask a question, well, was that Ernie Ladd? And another guy in the background says, no, Ernie Ladd's a bigger nigga than that. That Ladd is a big nigga.
I get on the elevator to go to my room, and the elevator operator says, you monkeys get in the back so everybody can get in. I said, you're an elevator operator and I'm a monkey.
We went out to get a taxi. Taxis were lined up out in front of the hotel. And Cookie Gilchrist, one of our players, says, hey, we want a taxi. And the guy says, we got to call y'all a colored cab. And Cookie said, hey, I don't care what color the cab is. I just want a taxi. Why can't we ride in one of these?
So we decide we're going to visit the French Quarter. The greeter standing there calling out to people, come in here, come in here. When we get close by, like a mute. And we get to another door. We get ready to go in. This little guy standing there pulls out a gun. You are not coming in here. You niggas are not coming in here. As a black man, I cannot go through this indignity and play a game here.
We were the last athletes or the last guys you want to try to intimidate.
We decided to have a meeting. We decided we're not going to play. You always remember the funny things that happen in situations like this. It says, okay, we're not going to play, right? We're not going to play. So Abner Haynes said, now don't let me go home and turn on TV and see you guys playing.
And I think then the question was the AFL going to scold them, go ahead and play the game without them, or were they going to support their players? And to the AFL's credit, they stepped up and supported their players and moved the game to Houston.
The fourth annual American Football League All-Star Game, switched from New Orleans due to a racial incident, attracts a slim crowd of only 15,000 to Jepson Stadium in Houston, Texas. Keith Lincoln takes a pitch out around the right side. The West blockers do a great job clearing the way. San Diego fullback steps off 80 yards to register another touchdown for the West.
The actual game was no Super Bowl, and the walkout was no Selma. But the AFL player boycott had a lasting impact.
I don't think that's ever been done before. I don't think there's a case of a boycott of a professional sport by the players.
And certainly athletes at that time were a privileged few enjoying benefits that very few other blacks enjoyed. And for this group of athletes to jeopardize that position, it took a lot of courage.
To have done anything else would have been a slap in the face of some of those civil rights marchers who were giving up a lot more than what we had given up.
By 1965, America and the American Football League had come a long way. But there was still a long way to go.
My general manager, Mr. Stedman, telling me, well, Abner, we don't condone what you did in New Orleans, and we think you led them. They wrote me a letter, 2-page letter, explaining to me how a football player's role is not to help his people. All I'm supposed to do is to play football and keep my mouth shut. Within 2 days, 2 or 3 days, I was traded to Denver. You'd be surprised how many were out of the game within a year or two. I know Cookie Gilchrist's career went down the drain after that. But I'm more concerned with being a good dad. And my son's not hearing 20 and 30 years later how I chickened out and didn't have no backbone. There was time for some men to stand up and be counted. I think that's what we did.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, there it is. How are you, everybody? Here's the formal introduction. My name is Tim Hanlon, and it's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. How are you? Thank you for finding us. We appreciate it. And thanks for sitting through what I hope is an excellent primer and setup for a very interesting and informative and important conversation that we have this week with our guest, Erin Grayson Sapp. She, the author of the literally brand new book, came out just a couple of days ago, called Moving the Chains, the Civil Rights Protest that Saved the Saints, that is the New Orleans Saints, and transformed New Orleans. And as you heard, this is a story of the American Football League, 1965, right smack dab in the middle of its life, and the All-Star game that was scheduled to be played in New Orleans. Now, this is a time when the New Orleans Saints didn't yet exist, and New Orleans was being considered as an expansion franchise for either or both the American Football League. That's where kind of the stuff got started. And ultimately the NFL, which is ironically what happened, expansion by the end of the decade into New Orleans. But this story, as we'll hear with Erin coming up in a few moments' time, a very, I think, underreported, underappreciated, and frankly, quite fascinating background to what became the New Orleans Saints. If you're a New Orleans Saints fan, live in New Orleans or an NFL fan, football, etc. If you don't know this part of the story, which predates and precedes, but not by much, the founding of the New Orleans Saints, well, stick around because you're going to learn a whole lot about the genesis of this franchise. And frankly, a compelling part of the history of the American Football League, the AFL, which, to you youngins out there, you think you know the NFL today. Well, the AFC would not exist had it not be for the AFL. That's kind of what essentially got pushed together in the latter part of the 60s to become today's modern day NFL. A lot of new franchises since then, of course. But so again, that clip comes from the just absolutely fantastic multi-part documentary series that appeared on Showtime I don't know if it's in the Paramount Plus library. I got to think it is. I hope so. If you streamers out there want to go find it. Again, it was called Full Color Football. It's literally the history. And true to its name, lots of full colorness on Showtime it was the history of the AFL, the American Football League. Peter Coyote, one of the great documentarian voices, or documentary voices, I guess, is the narrator of it. You can hear, for example, his voice in the latest Ken Burns documentary on the sad and convoluted story of the U.S. and the Holocaust that was on PBS last month. But Peter Coyote is probably the preeminent documentary voice these days. You heard voices of other important figures in this story. Dan Rather, Dave Dixon, a seminal character in this story, as we'll hear with Erin in a couple minutes. Probably the patron saint, if you will, of the Saints. And they're coming to New Orleans. Also, the patron saint of the USFL, the original USFL. Check out our episodes on that topic, especially with the great Jeff Pearlman, Dave Dixon, a founding component of the USFL. But some other great names, some easily remembered, some not. Larry Eisenhower of the Boston Patriots in there. Ernie Warlick, of Buffalo, the Buffalo Bills of the AFL. Which is coming out of Halloween. Ernie Warlick. Earl Faison of the San Diego Chargers, with a very blunt assessment of what was going on in New Orleans at the time. Abner Hayes, probably the most underappreciated personality in all of this story. He of the Dallas Texans and then the Kansas City Chiefs at that time in 1965. Our episode number 3 guest, Michael McCambridge, kind of setting the tone, is quoted in there. Jack Kemp of the old Buffalo Bills in that clip, and Ron Mix of the then San Diego Chargers. All of those people kind of sort of setting the tone for what was the background and the follow-through of the 1965 American Football League All-Star Game and the boycott, the protest, and all the drama around it, and what came of it. And in many cases, a large part of that, the New Orleans Saints finally emanating out of all of that. But it's a twisted and convoluted and not so direct story. And we get into all of that with Erin Grayson Sapp, our guest this week. Were the Saints the direct result of this boycott? Did things change? Have they changed in New Orleans, in football, in the NFL? Questionable. We get into all those dynamics as well. Regardless of any of those answers, an intriguing story, and one that needs and could benefit from a little bit more spotlight. And we certainly shine that this week on this story and our guest, Erin Grayson Sapp. The book is called Moving the Chains, the Civil Rights Protest That Saved the Saints and Transformed New Orleans. And that is the book that Erin has written. It is published by LSU Press, and we're going to talk quite a bit about it. And, of course, you can find a copy of it wherever fine books are found. Go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 284. There'll be a convenient link there for you to purchase it as well. And stay tuned. A great conversation with Erin Grayson Sapp in a few moments' time. A promotional message from, this week, our pal Judd Lesher down in southwest Missouri, Springfield, I believe it is. It's 417 Helmets.com. 417 Helmets, 417helmets.com. Collectible helmets and more. Lots of great stuff in there. Custom helmets is largely what Judd's been pivoting to of late. You want stuff made for your company, your organization, perhaps your high school or your grade school. Maybe it's even for another sport or some other. Maybe it's a birthday kind of celebration. There's no excuse to not make a customized mini helmet for whatever you've got in mind, just as long as it doesn't violate people's rights, I guess, in terms of logos and trademarks and that kind of stuff. But just go to the website, 417helmets.com, and just search the just click on the the custom helmets tab, and you'll get a sense of how to spec it all out and how Judd and his team can make you and delight you with your own customized mini helmet. And they're made from the finest materials, the same materials that go into the actual real life football helmets you see there on the field. The Schutt, Riddell, all these other great manufacturers, they make these mini helmets components, and Judd and his team can customize one for you for a fair price, for sure. But look, if you don't want something custom, you can get stuff from various leagues of yesteryear as well as today. So, for example, you want to celebrate the old World Football League, or the XFL, the original version thereof, the old and original USFL, World League of American Football, all those kinds of helmets and more. Historically are available for you at 417helmets.com, but maybe even stuff of today you might be interested in. If you're interested in, for example, college football, well, there's a huge array of not only NCAA helmets, but also NAIA helmets, those smaller colleges that have wonderful logos and stuff. I'm actually eyeing myself some of the TCU ones where my daughter now goes to college, and this is some great ones there, including the mini speed football helmet from 2015. It's gorgeous white with sort of the purple trim and the silver horned frog logo. And we're rooting for TCU because they're still, as we record this, undefeated, although I probably jinxed it. And surprising many in NCAA football. All of that kind of stuff and more. You pick the team. They're all there for you at 417helmets.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. It's Good Seats, and you will save 10% right off the purchase of any of those items that you find at 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more. Thanks, Judd, for your sponsorship of the show. We appreciate it. All right, let's dig in, shall we? Here's our conversation. Let's get into the fascinating story. The AFL, 1965, civil rights. The NFL, the idea of a team coming to New Orleans, not yet the Saints. All of that coming up in this conversation with Erin Sapp and Grayson Sapp. Her Sapp is her last name. Erin Grayson Sapp is the full name. It's a wonderful conversation. Here it is, please. As always, enjoy. For whatever reasons, we kind of obsess about, teams and leagues and situations that are no longer around or with us, but, are arguably still either for fun or for import, good to know about or remember or understand or maybe learn for the first time. The AFL is no stranger to our airwaves, right? So American Football League, obviously totemic contributor to what is now the modern day NFL and all that stuff. So that's kind of the hook that kind of drew me to this book. But before I get into sort of my bouillabaisse, give me and our audience a bit of a sense of who you are and, day job, night job, whatever, and how you came to this story in the first place.
Well, I was in grad school at Tulane towards the end of working on my PhD, and I was taking a history course, and I needed to find a topic to write a term paper on. And I just started digging through some old newspapers and whatnot. And I come across this story of a boycott by the American Football League of the whole city of New Orleans, right when New Orleans was trying to get a team. And I think, how have I never heard of this before? I've lived in New Orleans for long enough. I've been watching enough football. I can't believe, I don't even know that this happened, much less know the whole story and actually be sick of hearing about it. I just couldn't believe it was just something that had never been on my radar. Couldn't make it my dissertation topic, but couldn't let it go either. And as soon as I graduated, I was lucky enough to get a temporary position at a local archive, the Historic New Orleans Collection. And I could dig through old Sugar Bowl papers and Saints topics and research this book. And the more I learned, the more I realized that the boycott had made a big difference and was a story people needed to know. And I just became obsessed with getting the story out there. I felt like the men who instigated the walkout deserved some recognition. They deserved to know the difference they made and to have other people know the story as well. And so that was my motivation to get this lost story out there.
I forgot the famous author. She's so famous that I forgot her name, who says if you don't see a book about the topic you're interested in, then you're compelled to write one. So it seems like you fell into that trap. So congratulations there. But give me a sense. So you're studying history, I mean, but not necessarily sports. And I hear in your voice that you, or in your description, that you might be either a native or have spent a lot of time in New Orleans.
I have been in New Orleans since the year before Katrina. I had just enough time to fall in love with New Orleans before, I had to leave it for a while, but I definitely came back. And yeah, I was studying American history at Tulane, but not necessarily, sports history. It was actually an interdisciplinary degree that also involved English and art history. And so I wasn't really on the path of being a sports writer by any means. But yeah, I just couldn't let go of the stories. As you say, I realized it wasn't out there, and I felt the need to be the person to get it out there.
All right. So it sounds to me, though, that this story, as I've dug into it too, right? Because I was actually surprised in doing my, crack research that it was kind of a pothole of historical note, right? I mean, there are a handful of articles, from the old microfiche. There's a couple of mentions of it in, the American Football League documentaries and that kind of stuff. Some interviews and stuff. There's been some furtive efforts, I think, to kind of get a documentary together. I don't know if it actually was completed yet. But it feels to me like there's a concentric or a concentricity, to use a graduate level word, of different sort of things going on around this time that you sort of discover and laser in on this boycott. I think one of them is the AFL and the NFL and pro football generally. Perhaps 1960s America, which, is a backdrop and a foreground for a lot of stuff, civil rights, et cetera. A few individuals like Dave Dixon, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I guess more importantly is a place to start. And you tell me if you want to go in a different direction, but the city of New Orleans. One of the things that we have learned a long time ago as we started the show is that the pursuit of professional sports, especially 30, 40, 50 years ago, maybe even still today, was almost connoted among civic leaders to be the official imprint of major league status, right? You don't have a pro team or all the pro teams in the major leagues, right? Nobody's going to take us as a serious major city. I don't want to overload it, but maybe a little bit of background about New Orleans around this time and how maybe that's a starting point for this story, because New Orleans is obviously endemic to all of it.
That's hilarious, because my first thought was, I think New Orleans had that situation backwards from most other cities, looking at it that pro sports would make them, they wouldn't be a big league city without that. I think New Orleans was hesitant to be a modern city, a progressive city. If you think about it, part of the New Orleans identity is stagnation, a willful stagnation, just preserving these old traditions and this unique heritage that makes it the tourist destination that it is and the unique place that it is. So change really didn't fit with New Orleans's branding. And I think it wasn't so much that pro football would show that they were a modern city. I think New Orleans sort of reluctantly had to become a modern city because they wanted football that badly. I think that it happened in the reverse for the city of New Orleans.
So that's really interesting. So how much of your, from your knowledge, just generally as a scholar, how much of that is Southern, quote unquote, history? How much of that is unique specifically to New Orleans and Louisiana and its origins? Why do you think that is the case?
I think New Orleans's relationship with change in that sense was different than the rest of the South. New Orleans didn't necessarily consider itself as a stereotypical part of the Deep South. They've always thought themselves as something set apart. And we're going to be talking about the racial issue. I think that's true, that New Orleans always thought it was ahead of the rest of the South on racial issues, given its different background. So I don't think that New Orleans's resistance to modernity, for lack of a better word, was sort of the reactionary entrenchment that you might see in other Southern cities in the 50s and 60s. I think it was just we are New Orleans. We want to stay New Orleans. Change is not part of New Orleans. We are this place. I think in the book, I quote Time Magazine as referring to New Orleans as charming ruins. And it's what people know us as. We are this thing. And so if we choose progress, if we choose modernity, we're no longer this New Orleans that everybody knows and loves. So I think it was a different sort of resistance than you might find in other southern cities at the time.
That's interesting. Some would call that provincialism or some kind of unique sort of identity, I guess, approach, which is really interesting, right? Because you look at, the history, especially in the 60s and 70s, as some of these growing metropolises around the country, right, were angling to get, baseball or hockey or NBA franchises as pro sports was itself growing up, right? And you occasionally hear or saw New Orleans, discussed as a possibility in those places, but not as regularly and as persistently, I guess, as you might have thought about or imagined. Maybe that's a modern look back kind of bias, right? Given where, how we look at the demography of the United States today. It's curious, I guess, through a modern lens that was the case. But I think it's really important to understand because it is such a unique city and clearly was guiding or not guiding its thought process as to pro sports back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think New Orleans had its own interesting relationship with sports too. I mean, baseball failed and failed and failed and failed again in New Orleans. But there was just something about football that had a very interesting and strong power over the city that just invited in a lot of change that wouldn't have taken place, I don't think, for much else than football.
All right. Well, let's actually look at the reverse of this. So I'm also curious about your process. So as you discover the, untold story, if you will, of all of this, where do you start? Do you start with this actual scheduled AFL football game and work your way back from it? And what do you even know of the AFL and the NFL and pro football at that era, at this time, before you even get into that? I suspect not much about the pro football scene then.
You mean when I first discovered the story?
Yeah.
That wasn't what I was studying. That wasn't really where I thought my career was going. I stumbled upon this story, and I think there's a reason it's lost, because it didn't really make a difference. And I started researching it forward in the sense to see, did change happen? Is the reason the story's lost because nothing ever came of it? Realizing that it had been a big deal and had made a big impact on the city of New Orleans, I thought, well, how did we get here? And so I then, as you say, I started tracing it backward and just found this really great, in my opinion anyway, package that begins when the civil rights movement is just starting to make demands on the city of New Orleans in the mid-50s. And New Orleans handles it in a way that you would expect of lazy, permissive New Orleans. They think, sure, if you're going to give us good football, we'll make some changes. And integration goes very smoothly. And then there is a statewide backlash, a reactionary backlash, that introduces a whole set of new segregation laws that New Orleans stays under for almost a decade. And so then they have to come out of that, and that they're coming out of that when the walkout happens. So yeah, trace it back to that sort of breaking point. And I follow that story of New Orleans being under this reactionary cloud and trying to find their way out of it. And then when the walkout happens, sort of threatening their future in football, then big changes come from that. And ultimately, spoiler alert, they do get the New Orleans Saints. So that's sort of the package of research that I went into.
Well, let's center in on the event and maybe sort of radiate from there, right? So we're talking about the American Football League, which for most of our listeners, right, was the full color, if you will, challenger league to the NFL. Everything that the NFL kind of wasn't. Wide open passing and new markets and more exciting brand of football, whether it was designed that way or just became that way, and in many respects became kind of a more exciting alternative, and frankly was born by Lamar Hunt and his friends back in the late 50s, early 60s, being not allowed to join the club, right? It was a clubby, historical kind of cabal of owners who had been through the 20s, the 30s, the war, and this NFL thing was just starting to really, the kindling was really starting to catch, and it was becoming a true national sport after decades of questionability of such. But I guess before we sort of get to the dynamics of that, this also comes around. New Orleans has been looking at, or has been on the table for various football discussions in the early 60s, right? And I guess Dave Dixon is probably an important figure in all this, because it seems, in all the research that I've done, is that he's almost the chief instigator for getting a pro franchise of some sort to New Orleans circa early 60s.
Absolutely. Dave Dixon is the father of the Saints. He did all the legwork, essentially, in landing a pro football team for the city. And it was a long process for him too. He started in 1959, originally putting out feelers for a pro club, and eventually landed one for the 1967 season. But he is the story to a large extent.
And why? What is he? Just a native booster type that just for the contribution to the city and take it to the next level, or was it his own personal designs for fame and fortune and all that kind of stuff? What is the enigma of Dave Dixon, who, by the way, most of our listeners also recognize as the founder of, or the originator of, the idea of the old USFL too, which is interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, Dave Dixon is an incredible figure. I can tell you his motivation was that he loved football, and he absolutely loved the city of New Orleans. That was the best place in the world. But he was just a wide-eyed optimist. He was the most enthusiastic person I have ever encountered. And by encountered, I mean through digging through his personal papers in the archives. But he was a force, just unflappable. I mean, he got so close to landing a team so many times. It's almost unbelievable that he kept going and going and going and switching back and forth from trying to get a team from the AFL and then from the NFL, and his dreams just kept getting crushed, and he just wouldn't give up. So yeah, he's a legend in New Orleans.
But why was he? Why were why were the obstacles?
Well, from the very beginning, New Orleans' racial situation was the obstacle between the city having the biggest obstacle against the city getting a professional sports team. From the very beginning, when he just started collaborating with his friends and trying to get other people on board, the very first letters he was writing to his friends are all about how New Orleans can integrate and how it's going to be okay. We can do this. It would just take some strategic planning, but New Orleans can handle this. And then he also had to convince the league of the same thing. Oh, we've got this. We're going to get integration under control. And he kept being proven wrong. Like I said, he was very optimistic, loved his city, and also incredibly naive about the racial situation on the ground. So he kept making bigger promises than he could fill. And he kept getting called out for it in the Black press, for example. And there were multiple times when, for example, the Afro-American newspaper syndicate out of Baltimore and the well-known Sam Lacey was sending telegrams to the AFL saying, do not move into the city of New Orleans. They are not ready. And for example, on one occasion, pointing out that AFL game that New Orleans just hosted, well, they had block seating and separate hotels for the players. You cannot move into that town. So these types of things just kept happening. Race was definitely the biggest obstacle that Dave dealt with well before the AFL walkout.
That's interesting. And use the word naivete. That's especially important, I guess, because I guess what I'm also trying to maybe figure out then is, in the midst of all that, is sort of where is his base of I'm assuming financial and political support coming from to keep this idea going and alive and being a legitimate possibility. It sounds like it was absent of a pretty significant swath of the population in New Orleans, that not being white, so to speak.
Well, he really didn't have as much support as you might have expected. That's another thing about the city of New Orleans, it being so laid back and carefree. Everyone just kind of expected everyone else to do the things that needed to be done. And Dave was one of those people who was very gung-ho and driven and kept making this process go forward. But Dave didn't have a lot of buy-in from the local businessmen or politicians. Clearly, had he had buy-in from them, perhaps he wouldn't have run into the troubles that he did with, for example, integration.
Would you say that lack of buy-in, so to speak, was across the racial spectrum? I mean, were there, or was it largely a racially divided sort of dynamic?
Well, as far as I can tell from my research, the Black population in New Orleans supported the push for a pro team, but could not say they're going to support it under segregation conditions. So he did get pushed back while he was still trying to sort of ride the fine line to keep everybody happy. He was getting pushed back locally. But there wasn't a lot of pushback from, let's say, white New Orleanians against the segregation, the integration that he was calling for. There was just a slowness and a lack of motivation to have progress move forward. And so it was just, for New Orleans, it's a strange dynamic that tends to be the answer, that everything was just slow, not necessarily so divisive, not some heated battle, but just very slow in moving forward.
It's really interesting. So his attempt, though, so you say 59, 60 or so, was Dixon trying to get an NFL franchise from the outset, or was the AFL and its new arrival his sort of his entree into pursuit?
Yes, he did start with the AFL when he heard that they were forming. He met with Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams and tried to get New Orleans in for the inaugural season. I think the biggest problem he met with there was an appropriate stadium. Tulane was not about to just say, sure, we'll sign on real quick to this idea you have. It was going to take a lot more work and time for the university to sign on. And the City Park Stadium that he did have at his disposal was not considered to be of high enough quality for the AFL. So that was kind of what kept him out, in my understanding, from making it into the AFL for that inaugural season. And then after that, he kept switching back and forth between the AFL and the NFL, depending on what was going on and, what problems he had met from one league and then running off to the other league. So it was quite the love affair for Dave.
Part of that, though, I think included, I think you hinted at it before, there were some, I don't know, could you call them proof of concept games, an exhibition game or two to kind of sort of prove maybe that the market was viable? Was there any of those? I think there were.
Oh, that was fantastic. Yeah, actually, another local promoter had a Major League Baseball and a National Football League exhibition in 1960, and then again hosted an AFL exhibition in 1962 when Dave was very close to getting an AFL team. Dave had been meeting with Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams, and things were really moving along. He had sent earnest money to the league. He had gotten approval to use City Park for a pro team. He was on the next owners meeting schedule to make his final pitch for the team. They'd already been talking about player stockpiling and season ticket drives. And the other promoter, his name was DeFee, he had another exhibition game planned at that time for the summer of '62. And it was an absolute sellout. The permanent seats were taken, the temporary bleachers they erected were completely filled.
This is at Tulane Stadium, correct?
This was actually at City Park.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And yeah, Dave did decide eventually that he could handle City Park because he wanted football that badly. So he did and defeat did as well. To use City Park in the early years. So this was a complete sellout, proved to the to both leagues what a great fan base New Orleans had. I mean, fans were turned away. It was exceptional, and so from the beginning, both leagues were aware that this was a fan base they wanted to lock down. It was fantastic, but again, after that game, Black newspapers started printing stories about the separate accommodations, the block seating that was just sort of snuck in. I mean, tickets were supposed to be sold open, but they just slipped in the block seating, and so the exhibition games that were used to prove to the league that New Orleans would be a great league city were a double-edged sword. They proved that the fan base was great, but that there was a lot of work left to do on the racial front.
Yeah, intriguing, and frankly, also it brings a lot of things to the foreground, right? And it's not unimportant to remember the general tenor and various forms of change or not change that were going on nationwide and or in the region too, because some of those were similar and some of those were separate. 1964, right? The Civil Rights Act, right? Which historic, obviously, through the lens of time, just a totemic event in this nation's history for a whole bunch of different reasons. But, the general South, and again, we've already established that New Orleans enjoys being uniquely different, say, from the proverbial South. It is an explosive time, right? And there's a lot of pushback by a lot of different entities, and there's also a lot of embrace and the about time and progress, both sort of at the same time. So this backdrop of what's going on across the country and the region is not unimportant, because while the pursuit of a pro football team for a city is certainly the center of the story, it cannot be ignored about what's going on around that pursuit.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite things that came out of researching this book was the origins of the Atlanta-New Orleans football rivalry. Because Atlanta and New Orleans, when the book opens, New Orleans looks like it's a little bit ahead of the rest of the South. And from that moment on, Atlanta just shoots ahead. And they are making big strides on the civil rights front. And New Orleans, of course, is just sort of staying stagnant, as it does. And they're both trying to get a team at the same time, and they keep flip-flopping between being competitors for a team and then needing to maybe be companions to go in as a two-team addition to a league. And so it's just this interesting dynamic. And it also, as you say, it just makes it so much clearer what was going on at that time period in the South. One city embracing civil rights in a very exceptional way, and a sister city that has a completely different outlook on things. And then it all comes back to football. And, even before these two cities had teams, they were very strong football rivals. I mean, there's a later exhibition game in the city of New Orleans when there's also an exhibition game happening in Atlanta, and the announcer announces the attendance figures for the two cities, and the crowd goes berserk, louder than they were cheering for the actual football that they were there to watch. So it's just a super fun, interesting, telling dynamic, this comparison of the two cities at the time.
Well, and the NFL is not blameless in any of this either, right? I mean, even prior to that is, blatantly is probably an understatement, Frank. A racist owner in the Washington, then known as Redskins, George Preston Marshall, right? I mean, in many respects, that Washington football franchise, in his mind, was the NFL's, if you will, Southern region franchise, right? So the Atlanta, the New Orleanses, and later the Floridas of the world and stuff, he, and frankly, with kind of a wink and a blink from the league, his fellow league owners were kind of like, okay, that's your region, go for it, right? But yet, obviously, the devil's bargain, I guess, as part of that is, in some respects, that actually is also sort of an underlying current to sort of the explosive change. And maybe the AFL is partially, or maybe, partially part of some of that, and that this is a huge region that is in a lot of different areas progressive and ready for the big league city and football treatment.
Yeah, the difference between the both leagues thought it would be really great to have a flag planted in the Southeast. It was virgin territory, complicated territory, but virgin territory. And but in the leagues had a different relationship with that. It's interesting to me that the AFL had a reputation for really advancing the status of the Black athlete in pro football, scouting more aggressively to Black colleges, having a higher number of Black employees. But at the same time, the NFL under Pete Rozell's leadership and post the Washington Redskin integration that you were just referring to, they were doing a lot of cleaning up in a more aggressive sense that, for example, they were boycotting cities that they might have previously had exhibition games in if they didn't have full integration. Taking steps like that the AFL strangely was not taking as aggressively. And in my opinion, I think that could be explained, at least in part, by the fact that it was headed by two Texans, Bud Adams and Lamar Hunt, who were certainly very progressive when you're speaking about civil rights, but they had witnessed the growing pains of civil rights in southern cities, in Dallas and Houston, and had more faith in the process. I think they had more faith that it will get worked out. They kept coming back to Dave Dixon in New Orleans and giving them another shot in a way that you would be kind of surprising. And even quite quickly after maybe some sort of debacle and scandal, they would come back and reignite talks with Dave, for example. And it seems kind of surprising, but I think that the reason was not that they didn't care, but just that they maybe had a little more faith and patience in the process of racial problems getting worked out, because they had witnessed it in their own towns.
Well, I mean, that said, right, we also cannot ignore the fact that they're businessmen, right, in successes and frankly in pro sports around that time, especially, right, pretty much either, well, let's put it this way, either a success in other forms of business or life, and then becoming a franchise owner and whatnot. I mean, the business realities, right? You strip away all the progressivism and the process and the quote unquote virgin territory and the difficulties of markets and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the reality is that, at the end of the day, if they're going to create a viable alternative to the NFL, maybe achieve a merger or some other, or just grow the pie, from a pure business perspective, it seems like a logical thing to do, but clearly a complicated a business mindset that, it seems like Dave Dixon probably didn't sort of fully enter into his calculus. Maybe the other guys did. I don't know. It is curious too. For example, I've had a chance to look at old AFL records up at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And it was clear that, for example, after the walkout, that there was a tricky calculus to be done. There was the need to support your players and not lose any more fans on the basis of, having put a game in a city where that would happen to your players, any more backlash from civil rights groups or the Black press, but also just from a businessman's perspective, not agreeing with just immediately canceling an event that you had invested in. It was an interesting, careful game they had to play to figure out just the right response and how to handle it from a PR standpoint and a bottom line standpoint. All right. Well, let's get to the actual the game and the origins of this game and stuff, right? So, for some background, I mean, ABC for the first half of the decade and NBC for the latter half of the decade were gung ho on broadcasting the American Football League. It was, it's new football, it's new markets, all that kind of stuff, and was maybe surprisingly to some drawing great audiences with a very attractive product. Part of that development of the AFL was this AFL All-Star game. I don't think they did it in their first season, but from 61 onward, well, the 61 season, 1962, January is when they usually ran these games. Onward, they had essentially what we kind of know, or frankly used to know, as the Pro Bowl kind of thing, but for the AFL. I guess as a showcase, right? An All-Star game makes a ton of sense. Can you kind of give our audience a sense of sort of the how this game came to be? It sounds like it's another, shall we say, perfect exhibition opportunity for Dixon and friends to show that New Orleans is ready for pro football yet again.
Absolutely. Dave was hitting both leagues from every angle. He kept lining up more and more exhibition games. He approached both leagues, actually. He asked the NFL to move the Pro Bowl to New Orleans, and they refused, but he hit up the AFL for their All-Star game for that reason, just like you say, to show the leagues that New Orleans would be a great candidate to join the circuit. And he didn't stop there. I mean, he was trying to get both leagues to move their championship game to New Orleans and reconfigure their playoff system so that it would end in warm weather, neutral New Orleans, to have that be the new site. He was hitting both leagues up with that idea. So yeah, landing the AFL All-Star game for 1965 was just another one of the ways he was chipping away and just doing everything he could to sell the city to one or both of the leagues.
See, that's interesting because in some respects, I hear the seeds of what ultimately became, the Super Bowl, right? As a neutral, preferably warm weather exclamation point to one's season. I almost wonder, now that you mentioned that, if almost Dixon was maybe I wouldn't say uncredited idea generator for that idea, but it sounds like New Orleans uniquely is suited for that idea, which sounded a little unconventional at the time.
Yeah, I do know that anytime that after the merger was announced, anytime any member of the New Orleans press could get Pete Rozell's attention, they always wanted to know if New Orleans was going to be the site for what some people were calling already the Super Bowl. So it definitely was something that I think was connected to New Orleans, perhaps just because of the timing that way. But yeah, very well could be.
So roughly when was this selection of New Orleans announced? And was there any sort of intrigue or shenanigans or whatever in finally getting the designation that New Orleans would be the spot for the 1966 game, correct? But for the 65 season, was that right?
65 game for the 64 season.
There you go. Sorry, I knew I'd screw that up. I practiced and everything. This was, by the way, the last season I think that ABC was carrying the games. So we're talking about January 16th, 1965, the celebration, if you will, of the 64 season. So when was it announced, and what was the drama, if any, of the announcement and the post announcement and all that kind of stuff, the lead up?
Well, ironically, it was announced, I don't have it in front of me, but it was either right before or right after, and I'm talking days, right before or right after Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Interesting.
That is when it was announced that the game would be moved to, I think, from San Diego to New Orleans.
Okay, before you go further, on purpose or happenstance?
I think happenstance. It's just funny to me that I'm studying the game because of civil rights, and then I see that they get this game, right, those back-to-back announcements. And interestingly, on that note, I think that's part of what set New Orleans up for the disaster that ended up being the walkout of the players from the All-Star game, was that the Civil Rights Act is signed. New Orleans leaders come out quickly and say, we are going to comply. We don't want any violence. We don't want any pushback. And New Orleans fares well. They take it in stride. There's no major violence, no riots, anything like that. There's also not widespread compliance, but New Orleans is patting itself on the back because it didn't make any bad headlines. They seem to be doing well. They've come out from under all these segregation laws they've been under for years. They're doing well. They're back to their status quo. They're this wonderful progressive town they always thought they were. And they were just very complacent in that. And again, there's a naivety aspect to this as well. So I think that's part of what sort of set New Orleans up for bringing in this big game and thinking they were ready. And then everything just sort of blew up on them. I have a great quote from one of the AFL players afterwards who called it a false sense of full integration. And I think it's exactly what New Orleans had, a false sense of full integration, not realizing how far behind they'd gotten over the last almost decade of living under a rock of segregation, and not realizing how much catching up they had to do to participate in modern America.
So tell me about sort of the lead into the game. Obviously, this is literally announced days after the signing and the passing of the Civil Rights Act of '64. The game essentially scheduled about roughly 6 months after that. So Tulane Stadium is the location, and if I'm not mistaken, the Sugar Bowl, right, the college game of '65 is just before, about a week or two before this game on the schedule. There was little. What I know that was also a pretty interesting and crucial point in time, because if I have it says what in my research here, it was the first fully integrated Sugar Bowl. I don't know essentially what that means. I mean, the first time that African-American players were playing in a college bowl game in New Orleans, but it sounds like if that's the case, it didn't sound like there was a whole lot of, there were not a lot of issues with regard to that game prior.
Right. It was actually the first fully integrated game since the big host of segregation laws that I talked about from 1956. In the 1956 Sugar Bowl did have integrated stands, partially integrated stands, and an integrated team. 1965 game that, yes, was just about a week before the AFL All-Star game, had fully integrated stands and an integrated team. And it was praised widespread for how well it went off. It was Syracuse versus LSU. Syracuse, of course, being integrated, LSU not being, but the teams just showed the greatest sportsmanship. The Sugar Bowl hosts were hospitable. Everything just went off so smoothly to the naked eye, so to speak, that it did get just amazing praise, and everybody thought, see, New Orleans can handle this. Everything is going well. There were problems, though, that didn't get very much press. Some of the Syracuse players did, for example, have trouble getting taxis and then have doors shut on their faces, trying to go to places on like St. Charles Avenue or Bourbon Street. And so these stories didn't get as much attention. The widespread account was that the Sugar Bowl pulled off integration with no problems, and New Orleans is ready for integrated sports.
So how does the arriving teams, I guess a number of days, maybe a week before the All-Star game, maybe some specifics or some particular people involved, what were they experiencing, these players, as they were coming to New Orleans, getting ready ostensibly for the game?
Well, it didn't take long. As soon as players get to town, they're at the airport. One of them didn't even make it out of the airport. I think it was Earl Fison, didn't even make it out of the airport before he was insulted. The N-word was used in his direction. And other players would arrive, put their bags down on the curb outside the airport, and watch taxi cabs just fly past them, wait for hours for an African-American taxi driver to come pick them up. So a lot of trouble just getting to the hotel. And this is as soon as they land in New Orleans, they're running into problems like this. And, for some of them, as soon as they got to the hotel, they ran into more trouble. Some were told not to use the main elevator, to please use the side elevator. Others were told they couldn't eat in the restaurant in the hotel they were staying in. Some were insulted in the elevator of the hotel. It was just one problem after another, and they had not been in the city of New Orleans for more than 24 hours before they got together, talked about all the problems, put together this long list of all the ways they had been insulted and discriminated against, and decided to walk out. So it didn't even take a day.
I'm flabbergasted, of course, and again through the lens of history and looking back and stuff. But I guess the immediate question, and this was probably born in naivete myself, is why such open hostility and disdain? I mean, especially given a Sugar Bowl where it seems like people bent over backwards. It just seems so incongruent, like because they're pro players, because it's a bigger spotlight, perhaps something. It just feels so over the top.
It does, and I think part of it is because, as I said, the Civil Rights Act had just been passed, and New Orleans got credit for not having any major violence or anything, but a lot of places like touristy spots, like the Roosevelt Hotel, like nightclubs on Bourbon Street, hadn't even been tested yet. There hadn't even been a Black presence there yet. It was very slow for civil rights leaders in New Orleans to test the more touristy, popular establishments, and so these things just hadn't happened yet. So I don't know if it was just the suddenness that it hadn't even been addressed yet. And it also makes you wonder how many people in a hotel or on Bourbon Street are locals and how many aren't. So that makes me think about just the aura, the atmosphere of New Orleans, that it at that time still seemed like a place that was acceptable in. So I think there are several factors at play in that way.
And the genesis of the actual boycott itself, people coming together, a decision, a vote. Was there a vote?
There were a couple of votes. There was an initial vote by the 21 Black players, and they agreed unanimously that they would leave. Then sponsors called them all back to the Roosevelt Hotel to try to convince them to stay. And after a lot of negotiating and talking, they took two more votes. One, they decided that no matter how the final vote went, they would act in unison, even if it wasn't unanimous. And that vote on whether or not to leave actually was not unanimous in the end, but they all walked out together as a team.
And two figures in particular seem to stand out. Again, based on my crack research, you're the expert. Ernie Ladd, who was playing for the Chargers of San Diego, and Cookie Gilchrist seemed like they were kind of the chief definers of this situation. Number one, is that true? Number two, I get the sense that if there were some disdaining votes from a boycott, maybe was there some thought of maybe it would send a different or more strong statement by actually going through and playing the game? I'm just curious as to what the debate was, so to speak.
That was one argument that I know was made to the players. I'm not sure about amongst the Black players themselves, but that, yes, what about the idea of staying and making a statement here rather than just leaving? So that played into the debate to some extent. As far as who instigated it, I love that you also have the impression that Cookie Gilchrist was a big player in it, because that was one of the most surprising things when I got deep into the research, was to find out that he actually was not. He had such a reputation as a hothead and an instigator. As soon as he landed in New Orleans, he went to the Delta counter to make a complaint. And realizing who he was, the person behind the counter immediately said, "You're not going to give us any trouble, are you?" He just had this widespread reputation as a hothead and an instigator, but he had an exceptionally good treatment in New Orleans. He didn't even know anyone had trouble getting a taxi cab until the next day, when he got a phone call in his hotel room saying, "Hey, come on, we're all leaving." And he says, "Stop playing around, man. This is too serious. You're not leaving." He had no idea any of it had happened. So I think just because he already had that reputation, that story, I had read that version of the story myself before I dug deeper, and saw an interview he did and a different account he gave. It was so interesting to me to realize that he had very little to do with he had nothing to do with the idea of the walkout, and very little to do with even the debate. He was really sort of a side player in it all.
That's interesting. Well, arguably, this is why we discuss this, and why I think the book is so enlightening as to sort of what really happened. I guess the other sort of dynamic I'm curious about, and you and I are, but we're not in the room, right? But based on your research, of the non-Black players, I'm wondering where they were kind of settling into this conversation. How many, if any, were in support or not in support of this dynamic? I'm sure it was a very heated amount of hours trying to sort of flesh out the issues and what we shouldn't be doing.
Oh, that's a great story. I love this aspect of it. The first white player to engage the Black players as they're discussing the walkout was Ron Mix. He asked his coach if he could get off the bus, which was full of only white players because all the Black players were in the hotel room discussing the walkout. He got off the bus, went and made a very long speech about how he felt for them. He knew that their motivation was pure. He hated what had happened to them, but he just didn't think punishing the whole city for the actions of a few people was the right answer, and that perhaps they should stay, make a statement by staying. And it was a long conversation, and the Black players said things back to him like, you don't realize everything we went through. And they started relaying all their stories one after another to him. And he went back to his room and lay across his bed and just felt drained and felt like, I can see that I didn't make a difference. If anything, I might have made them angrier. And I know that they're going to walk out. And then he decided, and I'm going to walk out with them. He said, I want there to be at least one white player who says, I'm with you. And funny, he had just given an interview like the day before to a local reporter saying, the best thing about playing pro football is being with the guys and being in unison with the guys, even in times of misery. And I'm sure he didn't know how profound that was when he said it. But then before the Black players actually left, they did meet with their white teammates, and Ron Mix did want to be one player who said, we're with you, but it turned out one after another, Jack Kemp, Babe Purley, one after another, Jerry Mays, they all just said, hey, I'm going too. If you're going, I'm going. And I did not read an account of a single white player who objected. I don't know about, their personal feelings that didn't make it into any reports, but I never came across any stories of white players who were against the walkout. And actually, interestingly, the Players Association met with the owners at that owners meeting that was then moved to Houston, and they were expected to give a speech that was very divisive, complaining about rookie salaries versus veteran salaries, Joe Namath's big bonuses, very divisive issues. And they basically said, we've come to a new understanding of the relations of men. And it was a very unified, very team-focused sort of statement that they ended up giving to the owners. So it was really cool to see that the event did go down as all the players in full agreement.
Okay, so mechanically, and I don't want to give away all of the book, right? Because we want to encourage people to read it, because it's this amazing detail and dynamics of this. So the game, right, scheduled for January 16th. When does this boycott get sort of congealed into a thing, and how does it get communicated, and what happens, right? Because Commissioner Joe Foss had to make a decision. It looks like he made a decision to change the site of the game because of all this.
Right. Yeah, I think the walkout was official on the 11th. So they had about 5 days to throw things together. The idea was that the AFL did not want their game to go down as a strike. They wanted to do whatever they could to salvage it. And immediately Miami called them up and said, hey, we'll host it. They'd already actually accepted a conference that New Orleans lost because of some racial issues, and they successfully hosted it. But the league decided, we've taken enough chances, let's stay in the league. So and Houston was very close, geographically. So Houston was chosen. They thought they could rush everything over there quickly. It was kind of humorous. Some guys, Black guys left They did not wait around. They said they were walking out, and they did. Some of them had just gotten home, then they get back on another plane and go to Houston. A couple of guys were driving from New Orleans to the Grambling area, Lincoln Parish, and they hear on the radio that the game got moved to Houston, and they just get back on I-10 and head towards Houston. So it was very rushed and chaotic. But I think the idea of moving it to Houston was just to do everything they could to salvage it as simply as possible.
Did any of the players not go at all?
No, the only player I've come across who didn't go to the game, I wondered that myself, and I looked further, and it appears that he just had backed out of, not backed out for bad reasons, but could not make the game in general. So wouldn't have been in New Orleans either. So I haven't read of any players who didn't go to Houston.
All right. Well, I'm not sure there's any game footage from ABC of that game. Did you discover any by any chance?
Sadly, no. I have watched a lot of VHS game tapes in this process, but that wasn't one I could get my hands on.
Yeah, because I'm really curious as to how, if at all, was it described and the situation to the audience. I mean, did they, kind of, I can't imagine that they would have not only acknowledged the fact that they're only playing in front of 15,000 people in Houston when, a week prior it was scheduled to be at a sold out Tulane Stadium.
I've wondered that myself. I would love to hear what the announcer said and how it was handled. But the only thing I know is Joe Foss's quote in the program that they hastily threw together for that game, just thanking Houston for handling it in such big league fashion, which I felt like was a little jab to New Orleans for not being of big league status.
All right. Well, I know this is hard to sort of. So how can we cul-de-sac this for the aftermath, right? Because there are effects on this boycott and what's happened on the trajectory of the AFL, the trajectory of a pro football franchise coming possibly somehow or not to New Orleans, and what ultimately became the Saints in the NFL. I mean, when you think about it, in the moment, I think the last thing most people would kind of imagine at that moment would be that there would be pro football by the end of the decade in New Orleans. And I guess the immediate aftermath was that the AFL was like, that's it. We're not even going to touch New Orleans going forward, right?
Right. Yeah. The AFL definitely knew they had to distance themselves from New Orleans, even though some of them kind of felt bad because they had befriended Dave Dixon, and but they knew the only viable stance was to definitely distance themselves from the AFL. I mean, from New Orleans. And it also played out when within 6 months, the NFL and the AFL are battling over their top spots in the South, and they're fighting over Atlanta. And Dave gets excited because he thinks maybe whoever loses is going to come looking his way. And even ends up having a conversation with Lamar Hunt at that time about it. But I think, as you say, the AFL just had to distance themselves from New Orleans, no matter how good of friends Lamar and Dave were. And as you know, Miami got the nod from the AFL instead.
But how then does Dixon somehow continue and then successfully bring the NFL to the city by the end of the decade? Is it Rozelle seeking opportunism? Is there a nobility out there? Is it just a vacuum now? I'm just really curious because it just seems like it feels in the immediate aftermath of this situation. I find it incredibly hard to believe that a pro team comes about relatively shortly thereafter.
It's a great story. And I think the answer is going to also answer how the story got lost, because when the walkout happens, New Orleans realizes, as you say, their shot for going pro in either league is most likely ruined for quite a while. And at first they just kind of stew. They're angry. They think it was unfair that the AFL walked out and blacklisted them that way. And then after Atlanta goes into the NFL announces that they're going to expand again within a year. And that was like a starter's pistol went off. It got everyone excited to show the NFL that the AFL was wrong, show the NFL that we're a united, progressive city. And the atmosphere in New Orleans changed. Suddenly it was okay to want progress and to push for change in a city that always resisted change and always just wanted to preserve its heritage and traditions. So there was this immediate switch and a massive drive to clean up the city, to get the city where it needed to be to house a pro team. And a lot of it was concrete things like integrating taxis and restaurants and clubs, things like municipal hiring of African Americans, things of that nature that you can calculate. There was also just, as I say, just the massive drive, the massive push for change. It suddenly became okay to speak that way and to be open about a liberal agenda. And all of this is framed as, let's show them how progressive we were all along. So they don't exactly advertise that they changed. The city just advertises that it is what it needs to be. So in that way, the locals kind of just brushed the story under the rug and just kept insisting that they'd always been this progressive, deserving city. And so the change did take place, and New Orleans had made big improvements in this short amount of time. It did happen, and it did happen very quickly. But it also helped considerably that when the AFL and NFL decided to merge, that they needed antitrust legislation approved by Congress. And Louisiana had two very influential congressmen at the time that greased that legislation through for Pete Rozelle and earned them a promise of a team. So that was the other version of the story that got accepted, that New Orleans got a team in 1967, or was granted in 1966, because of this handshake between Hale Boggs and Pete Rozelle. And New Orleans loved that story. I mean, shady politics, New Orleanians will claim that. They'll stick with that story. But the story of having to clean up their racial situation really quickly, well, that wasn't their favorite part. So let's just put that back under the rug and we'll stick to this story. So that is how they got a team as quickly as they did after the walkout. But the improvements did happen as well.
All right. Well, so maybe you can characterize then how and if this boycott, the success of it, did it achieve essentially what it kind of it aimed to do? I argue it came together pretty quickly. I'm not sure there was a whole lot of forethought, but it was just in the moment and the right thing to do amongst those who made the decision. Would you, based on the depth, and obviously we've only kind of scratched the surface on some of the more intricate issues and the dynamics of all this, but I mean, I look on a couple of levels, right? I mean, NFL franchise achieved, right? Don Dixon seems like that's a win in his column. New Orleans, gets sort of an excuse to be considered a major city, even though maybe some of the major issues that were kind of driving this boycott and prior to it were not necessarily directly addressed. There's a question in there somewhere. What do you think the specific event and what came about it? I mean, do you think mission accomplished, or is it more murky than that? I suspect it's the latter.
Well, that's interesting because I know you said that you've seen some small accounts of, maybe a partial documentary or things like that have described the walkout. I've also seen accounts that were rather brief and considered the walkout a success because it moved the game and it showed the power of Black athletes, and it did that. I lament that it got lost, that it had much bigger implications than that, a much greater effect. And I do believe it was a success because it, as one of the players said, I mean, while still in New Orleans, walking out of the hotel, like, talking to the press, as I said before, said there was a false sense of full integration. It showed New Orleans, you think you're progressive and cosmopolitan, look how far you have to go. It made that very clear, and it set it in motion. And as I said, I hate that many of these players have died without probably realizing themselves just how much of an impact the walkout did have. It did even more than just show that there was the power of the Black athlete, moving the game, all of that. It really set things in motion in New Orleans in a big way that has never really been detailed before. And that was, as I said, always my motivation was to get these guys some recognition for that. I certainly don't mean to fairy tale it out and act like there weren't any racial problems after that, or that there aren't any now. Of course, I would never make any claims like that, but the progress that it set in motion was very real. And I do think that it was successful in that way. And I think, just according to what I've seen some of the players say about their motivation for the walkout, I think they would have considered it a success, because the point was to point out what was wrong in New Orleans and that it wasn't acceptable at its most basic form. And I do think that they achieved that as well.
It really feels to me like it's almost an underreported or under-remembered turning point for a bunch of concentric themes, right? New Orleans for sure, pro football, right? And the merger and all that kind of stuff, and Black athletes and their not only contributions but influence and outsized importance in society, but obviously reflected through sports and pro football. This feels like a powder keg of a story that, frankly, is much more, I think, important maybe than most people realize or didn't even know about.
Exactly. I mean, that's how I've always felt about it, that it is an important story for so many different people, for so many different reasons, as you say. It is still kind of surprising to me that it got hidden for so long. But then there are explanations of how that happened, of course, as we were just saying, with the shady politics and the pridefulness of New Orleanians and all these factors that just sort of kept the story tucked away. But as you say, for it to intersect so many different important realms, it makes it kind of shocking that it's been tucked away.
Well, as we wrap up here, I'll say it more pointedly. There's also the hagiography of the NFL, right, which has plenty of issues, but is the king of pro sports in this country, right? And as the history gets refined, shall we say, there's sort of that. People look at the AFL, for those who even know what the AFL is. Hint: look at the AFC. That's where it came from. There's this sort of Challenger League, 10 years, lots of colorful games, much more open passing, more new markets. Boom, it's just an instant gigantic expansion and stuff, and the challengers and all that kind of stuff. But things like this, right? Not only an undercurrent, but frankly, in some cases, like this All-Star game boycott, right at the forefront.
Absolutely. And I really thought that the NFL would want to embrace this story, although, as you said, they're not blameless in this entire saga of what football was like in the 50s and 60s. But it shows that love of NFL football can dramatically transform a broken city. It's a really great feel-good story. And I've got to admit, one other thing about my motivation for writing the book was always to give these guys some actual recognition. I would love to get the story in front of someone with the NFL and let these guys stand on a sideline of a game and wave to the crowd. I mean, I just feel like the NFL should embrace this story and give the few remaining All-Stars that we still have with us some gratitude and recognition. I'm a dreamer, but I would love to see that happen for these guys.
Well, that's my last question is where, and we obsess about some of this kind of stuff, especially when it comes to teams and leagues that, depart or they go to another city, and is there a retroactive continuity thing like the Cleveland Browns and all that kind of stuff? I mean, there's all kinds of hiccups and stuff to make, shall we say, history more convenient. And it's a cynical comment, but it's true in some cases, sadly. How much or how little, if at all, have the Saints and or the NFL embraced this story, remembered it, commemorate it, or if not, might this book and the promotion around it perhaps spur such somewhere, somehow, some way?
I absolutely hope so, because to answer your first question, I don't think the Saints and or the NFL have acknowledged this story. Okay, that might not be fair, because the Pro Football Hall of Fame has a little video clip of Ron Mix talking about the walkout, and maybe some other guys are interviewed in videos. I haven't been there in years, but there is acknowledgement of it in at least video form in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So it is acknowledged and recognized to that extent. But as far as really celebrating it and commemorating it and giving recognition to the players who instigated the walkout, I've sadly never come across any example of that. And as I said, that has been my very sort of Dave Dixon level optimism while I was writing the book to hopefully get these few remaining guys and perhaps the families of the guys we don't have with us anymore some recognition for being courageous, taking this brave step and making a real change.
Okay, our thanks to Erin. Much interestingness there in this conversation. Much interestingness also in the actual book, which goes into much more depth. And you will be rewarded by purchasing a copy and reading it for yourself. It is called, again, Moving the Chains, the Civil Rights Protest That Saved the Saints and Transformed New Orleans. It is published by LSU Press. It is available right now wherever you find good books. Of course, you can go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Erin Grayson Sapp, number 284, if you're scoring at home, and you'll find a convenient link that'll take you to Amazon. Probably the quickest way you can get this book, and you get it in paperback form or in Kindle fashion. And however you would like to expedite said book coming to your domiciled location, you will be rewarded very quickly thereafter. Let's see. While you're online, you can also follow us on various social media. Now, as of this moment, we're still sticking with Instagram, with Facebook, and with Twitter. But we are clearly trying to look for some other places. We're also on YouTube. Let me give you those handles. You can follow us there as long as we can hold on in those places. On Twitter, we'll be found at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you will find us at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, you can find us at Good Seats Still Available. And on YouTube, our new handle is at Good Seats Still Available. Email. You can send us some at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. What else? I think that's kind of it. Thank you, Jerry Payne, the good doctor, for all your knob twiddling. We appreciate that. And thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And hope you'll stick around for next week's episode. Who knows what we'll be talking about? I'm sure it'll be interesting for sure. And thank you for listening. We appreciate it. Take care until next week. Stay safe. Bye.